My role at this stage is to simply, I think, introduce the chair for this session, who is Roger Bolton, well known to most of us, of course, long-term broadcaster, radio and television, including editor of Panorama, long-term presenter of Feedback, and now the originator and interviewer on Feedback, an excellent podcast which I can recommend to all of you, and a VLV patron. So it's over to you to introduce the panel, Roger.
Thank you. I should say that the other, the co-founder of Beeb Watch is Kate Dixon, my producer, who does, as producers do, most of the work, and as producers do, take little of the credit. Thank you very much for asking me, an officially old person now, I understand, to present something. I've passed the magic 74. Actually, I passed it some time ago. Anyway, look, this is a thrilling, successful time in audio. And I don't think that anything we're going to go into and discuss should detract from that. It's an extraordinary period. And we've got quite an exceptional, I think, panel to discuss where we are now, where we're going, and some of the issues that arise, and whether there's a need for regulation in any form. Whether it is the Wild West we're moving into or not. I'd like to introduce the panel, and I'd like them also to introduce themselves, really. On the far right, we've got Matt Deegan, who I have to say has his own podcast. But you do far more than that, Matt. Just fill us in about your background.
So I'm very fortunate. I work on a number of different audio businesses. A company called Folder Media that provides consultancy services to broadcasters in the UK and Europe. We also run a national children's radio station called Fun Kids on digital radio, also on podcasts. And we have a business that looks at marketing for podcasts and works with people like Sky and other large organisations.
So next to Matt is Aradhna Tayal Leach. She's MD of the Radio Academy. What does the Radio Academy actually do?
Good question. Hello. So the Radio Academy is the... it's not a joke, I promise. The Radio Academy is the UK charity that promotes excellence in audio and radio. So what does that mean? We're here to support people who are working in audio and radio. That's across podcasting, streaming, academia, radio, and everyone from presenters, producers, engineers, the brand specialists and more. And we're here to support people to have a really meaningful career in audio through their lifetime, from getting into the industry all the way through to the heights that you've achieved.
Well, I hope we pursue whether it's possible actually to have a career, given the way things are going. We'll pick that up a little bit later. Next to her is David Lloyd, who I could have introduced before years ago in many guises, but now runs Boom Radio.
Thank you.
Round of applause almost is required for that for people of my age. But David, tell us about Boom Radio and your background.
So I've been in this wonderful medium for 44 years ago yesterday, actually. That was my anniversary, because you make a note of these things. Largely in commercial radio as a broadcaster, and also more recently as an executive, as a manager, creating and running radio stations as well as I can. I did have a spell in regulation at the Radio Authority, 2 fascinating years. Don't quite know why I went to work there, but it was an interesting time, and some time also at the BBC, so a varied career. And as Roger said, more recently, 3 years ago, we set up a radio station for those of us who dare to be aged in our 60s, 70s and beyond, and that's called Boom Radio, which is exhausting and we're loving.
And finally on the panel is Jonathan Wall, who's director of BBC Sounds. Does that mean anything that makes a sound and comes out of the BBC is you? No?
I would probably determine it as the sort of digital transformation end of BBC Radio. So I'm one of 3 directors running BBC Radio. I've been in the BBC 30 years. I started out at BBC Radio Humberside. I had a career in BBC Sport and then ran Radio 5 Live, and now I'm in the current role.
And when you said there are 2 others, what do they do as opposed to what you do?
So a director of speech, Mohit, who I think was just here a few minutes ago, director of music, Lorna, and my job intersecting with both of their jobs is to essentially protect the hell out of live radio, on-demand speech, on-demand music going forward.
Well, just before we get going on some of the issues here, I'd just like to quote some research by Enders Analysis, and where would we be without Enders Analysis? Here are some brief summaries of where we are. Radio listening is strong, but with a dramatic decline among the under-24s. Smart speakers will accelerate the trend, and while the draft media bill's intervention is helpful, it's not a cure. This was their analysis of UK radio in 2023. The commercial sector is thriving through the launch of digital-only stations and major players taking advantage of deregulation. The issue of attracting a new generation is pressing, and the once dominant BBC has a loyal older following hampered by regulation. It is difficult to see how younger audiences will develop an affinity with its audio offering. And looking at those audiences, breaking it down just a little bit, they say radio listening has held up remarkably well over the past 10 years. Today, as Caroline Dinage said this morning, 88% of the UK listen to radio each week, with listening down just 2% since 2013, so only losing that in 10 years. However, there's always a however, there has been a dramatic decline in listening among the under-24s, albeit not yet at the rate of TV. The BBC and the commercial sector seem unable to arrest this youth audience decline. And listening continues to move away from analogue, with many unviable AM transmitters turned off and licenses handed back. Bauer turned off its national AM service, Absolute Radio, in January, with Ofcom fining the company just £25,000. And finally, transition is no longer to DAB, but to online, which now accounts for 25% of all listening. This has been driven by the take-up of voice-activated smart speakers, with major operators quick to develop necessary skills. Right, that's Ender's analysis, and thank you to them at the end of last year. Matt, let me pick you up. Is that, in your view, that's accurate? And what has happened in the last few months, do you see, particularly in the podcast area?
So it's pretty accurate. I mean, I think we are in a golden age of audio listening. Nearly 90% of the country listen to radio each week. They listen for 1 billion hours. There is problems with younger audiences, not necessarily in reach, the number of young people that listen to the radio, but in hours, that's the amount they listen. So it's not like they've disappeared from the medium, it's just not as essential as it might be for older age groups. I think that's definitely a challenge. At the same time, we've seen an explosion in podcasts. About a third of the country listen to podcasts each week, which is a decent number, but not comprehensive. And the reason people are listening to podcasts is it's providing deeper interests, deeper programs that really cater for people's individual interests. That can be quite broad, something like politics, or it can be something really, really focused, a branch of science, perhaps, and can find a home with people. So for consumers, they've been able to taste and listen to much more audio than they've ever had before, and they're consuming much more. For commercial radio, that's meant they've changed their business model away from local radio to now more nationalised service, having to expand into other areas like podcasts to reach these audiences. The challenge for them is with revenue, with the money that pays for all that radio. A lot of that money has moved to online, particularly to Google and to Facebook's parent company, Meta. So they have to work harder to attract that revenue. At the same time, the BBC has drifted away from being the dominant provider of radio in the UK, and that's partly because commercial radio has been able to catch up with the amount of distribution that the BBC historically has had. Though really, whilst commercial radio is ahead, it's pretty close to 50-50. And the BBC obviously faces challenges from the licence fee, will the way the BBC's funded change, and how does it stay connected to audiences on digital?
Just on podcasts, can I pick up, because anybody could write a novel, but most people wouldn't want to read the novels that are written, and certainly wouldn't read mine. When you look at the podcast, can you break it down into areas? I mean, there are some, clearly, for example, Movers and Shakers, which is a wonderful podcast, and it's clearly identified a group of people in this country, a very large group of people, and also in Europe. I know a friend in France who listens, who are, it's just wonderful for them to listen to a program made by people with Parkinson's disease, talking about those issues, explaining their problems, and it's uniting people in a way that hasn't been done before, and arguably broadcasting couldn't really do on a sustained basis, and a podcast does. I can see also podcasts where people use podcasts as an extension of their brand. You're a comedian going on the road, you basically are trying to sell your appearance, podcasts can help you sell it. So it's an extension of the brand. How would you analyse podcasts, add to that analysis?
Yeah, I think the book publisher analogy is a really simple one. You know, there are lots of people who write books because they'd like to write a book. And there are people who make podcasts because they just like to make a podcast. If they happen to find an audience, that's wonderful, but not a focus. As you said, there's definitely people that use it as an extension. So their business model isn't selling adverts in their podcast. It's going on tour or selling a book or something else that they might do. One of the challenges for podcasting is it's a very long tail by which there's a very few number of shows that are really big, and then the sort of tail goes into the distance with kind of less and less listeners. So it can be quite hard to make that pay, but for some people, they don't need it to make it pay. The example you gave there, the show about Parkinson's, I was talking to one of the producers, and when you look at the people who obviously have Parkinson's, but then all the families and friends around them that are interested in what's happening to one of their friends or their family, that audience grows. Now, it wouldn't necessarily been a space for that on a linear radio station, but it can find an audience that's maybe 40 minutes a week that are interested in that, and also an audience that aren't listening to every episode.
Now, I know about that. I think Movers and Shakers is financed by or subsidised, should I put it this way, by there's a judge on it, and his chambers finance it. So it's not, even that's not making money. Do you think many podcasts actually, outside of Gary Lineker's Gold Hanger organisation, actually make money? Or are we looking at podcasts in a way like first-time novelists have to do it? It's not the main job. They have a job, and in their spare time they do it. Is that the more general model?
I think if you looked at most shows, and there's about 100,000 active shows out there, most aren't making money from it, but that isn't essential for them to exist. Where I think the focus that's interesting is the people who are doing podcasts for a business. Can they make a living from it? Can they get an audience for whatever idea they've got to sustain themselves and the people that they work with? And there are definitely companies that do that. Some are people with long experience in radio or other media, or people who just have a very good connection with an audience. It's an amazing podcast production company called Fellas Studios, who came from YouTube, kind of young people, very disconnected to audio and didn't come from radio. They sort of came from originally making videos in their bedroom. But they've got a great relationship with their audience, and they're managing to bring that to audio. And maybe they'll help arrest that decline of young consumers.
Jonathan, can I bring you in here, though? Why is the BBC what's its strategy for podcasts? And what's its ambition? You hear a Director General continually saying, I want a digital-first BBC. Yet we've also heard people say the networks will be around a lot longer, and et cetera, et cetera. So what's the strategy? What are you trying to do?
So our job is to deliver value for everyone who pays the licence fee. There is an increasing audience need state change that we've seen through television, where more people now want their speech when they want, how they want, at the time they want, right? So you're then thinking through a strategy which is about evolving live radio and also evolving on-demand speech. That's in essence what it is. And there is a place for both, and there is a challenge on both. But it is a fact now in the country that more under 35s consume podcasts than they do live speech channel radio, right? We have to acknowledge that and react to that. It's also true there's still millions of people consuming Radio 4 and 5 Live, so it's about playing both as much as you can. But you can't do one without the other.
It's not just about delivery, is it? It's because you're also... What can you do with podcasts that you can't do with broadcast?
So, it's on platforms like Apple and Spotify that are popular with young audiences, where you can reach young audiences on there as well as through your own platforms. You can, as I said, that need state of me consuming a podcast that's not in a schedule, that's a real life need state for audiences that you have to meet. So we have a podcast newscast that delivers to hundreds of thousands of people every week. So you're thinking through what your programs can do on a schedule, but what extra job might they do outside the schedule? But
do you think there are I'm struggling for the correct language, but are there podcasts which you want to do, which won't, if you get repeated, or won't contain content from broadcast programs? In other words, that are discrete in themselves, perhaps targeted at young people.
It's a good question. So most of our podcasts are also placed on schedules, but there are some that wouldn't necessarily fit into what the schedule of 5 Live is, which is a live news and sports station, wouldn't be quite right for Radio 4. So we've got one flying high in the podcast charts. It's an entertainment title with Lily Allen and Makita Oliver. That wouldn't be right in one of our schedules, but is totally right sitting there in a Spotify, Apple chart and on sales. So most of the value you can extract is on a Sliced Bread is a huge show on Radio 4 and it's a big podcast. So there are ways of extracting value from both, but certainly there are some titles that are podcast first, and that's essentially what they are.
Now, your starting point in approaching these issues is people pay their license fee, they all have to pay it, they still pay it. We have to continually give them more or better or whatever. You can see that drive. But then, David, that must be extremely irritating when you're doing something like you're doing, where you're into an area, you identify something that the market isn't providing, you go in there with Boom Radio, you're pretty successful, and then the BBC follows you in there. Who funded? I mean, so have you risked your own money with Boom Radio?
I have, indeed, I've drawn some money out of my pension, so, if it goes wrong, I'll be on the streets. Yes, I have. I mean, we identified a gap in the market, and that Radio 2 was clearly shifting, BBC Local Radio was shifting, and I could see, certainly for Radio 2, what that shift was about. As a programmer, I correctly agree. It baffles me why BBC Local Radio has gone where it's gone, but that's a session for another for another day, or maybe today, yes. So we'd identified that gap in the market for people, as I say, who dared to be aged over 60, and we wanted a radio station they could call their own that didn't treat them like being old folks. That's what Boom Radio is about. We launched ourselves with our own cash during lockdown, and we've got an ever-growing audience. So you can imagine how irksome it was, and I'll be honest, and I respect Jonathan, and we explained jolly text and all sorts, but for this new service from the BBC to be launched suddenly, which could kill the service we have created.
Just for the audience, just spell out what the BBC News Service does and why it overlaps with what you're doing.
Thank you. The BBC is proposing 4 new audio services, initially launched online and later on DAB+. And the larger of the 4, by some margin, will be a spin-off from Radio 2. And it will play 50s, 60s and 70s music, largely hosted by best-loved personalities. And at Boom Radio, we play 50s, 60s and 70s music hosted by much-loved personalities. We do a lot more than that as well. So it is completely over what we do, and it's commercial-free. So we feel that's unfair competition, as you can imagine.
There are 2 principles here, aren't there? And then collision, somebody must decide. On the one hand, there is the understandable BBC, we've got to give value for money, there's an audience, we have to deliver it, our obligation to do it. There's your point of view, which is, heavens above, I've risked my own money, my own pension on establishing an area, and then in comes the behemoth, which is the BBC, and does it. So there are 2. Now, presumably what should happen is the government should take these decisions, Jonathan, shouldn't they? Deciding between where you are doing unfair competition and where you're not. So what are the steps? When you propose a new service like that, what are the hoops you have to go through to get it on air?
So first question is, in order to deliver audience value from a brand like Radio 2, we think this is a sensible but proportionate extension to deliver value. If it was a giant elephant in the room and would do what David described, there is no way a regulator like Ofcom would allow that to happen. We then have to argue that it's distinctive. What we would have, for example, is incredible speech archive of old interviews that have not been aired for a long time that would be part of that content. We would be able to play old concerts and music archive that would be different from what they do. So our argument would be distinctive, proportionate. This is a very small amount of reinvestment money. And of course, we don't want to do anything that's an elephant in the room that is going to have a massive impact on a great new starter like Boom, right? But ultimately, a strong regulator takes a view, understands David's position, understands what we're trying to do, and then makes a decision.
Jonathan's outlined the process, and that's currently underway. It is, reading through the detail of what is proposed, during the day, it's a music service. The speech archive isn't in there. It's a music, in its own words, a music-intensive service. So actually, it's very similar to what we do. And also, we're a bit concerned because we find the whole proposal misleading. The budget that's been put forward, 0.4 million, we spend about that on our service. I'm sorry, I really cannot see how the BBC can honestly deliver that service on that budget, and I think you're misleading people by putting that figure in the public domain.
I mean, that's not correct. We are unlocking value from programmes we already make. You can go on Sounds now and listen to programmes like Sound of the 60s. We're unlocking that value putting in a very simple schedule with a small amount of new commissioning. And our job is not to preserve the brands that we've got, is to absolutely look after them for the next generation. This is a proportionate move to protect the brands of Radio 1, Radio 2, and Radio 3. And, we've all had to save a lot of money. This is a small amount of reinvestment. We reinvest in two areas. One is in that podcast work, and Matt's described why that's an interesting area for the industry, and one is in these sensible, proportionate brand extensions. So, as I said, if the regulator, and we have a strong regulator, takes the view that it feels too big, and our job is not to be a market failure organisation, it's to deliver value for licence fee payers. If a regulator thinks it's a bit too elephant in the room, there will be a view that they will make. I think that's fair. I think that's a fair position.
Last word, David, on this point.
Just one final point, just to make it more broadly. I think it does come back to the point you raised earlier on about the future of the BBC, the funding, why it's there, what its role is, and it's a good thing that that debate is now happening. But I think it's more rather than how is the BBC funded, I think we should be looking at first of all, what the BBC should be doing in a world of podcasting, in a world of so many commercial stations now, so many linear forms of DAB plus streams. In that world, what should publicly funded media be doing, and therefore what is the amount that needs to be funded?
I think that's what the VLV is obviously concerned. You get the ducks in the order. First, what is public service broadcasting in the 21st, however say it now, should be? What's the best way of delivering it? What's the best way of paying for it? But let's have the debate first, instead of just defending particular organisations. Could I just pick up, before we go any further, and I do want to talk with Aradhna about what it's actually like, whether you can have a career in the industry. But just one thing is, Jonathan, about adverts on podcasts, which we heard raised earlier, which the BBC is discussing. Again, that's a big area, because essentially, probably it's taking away advertising from other areas. Why do you want to, or why are you considering putting ads on podcasts?
Yeah, so very happy to give you the context. So we have a commercial arm of the business, BBC Studios, tasked with bringing in commercial revenue. It's great that they're interested in audio, first of all, in this buoyant industry of ours. Their main job is to extract commercial revenue outside the UK as a business. Now, what we have explored is where audiences expect adverts on the likes of Spotify and Apple, and this is an exploration, and no decision has been made, it's something we've just been looking at, is it feasible? Is it the right thing to do to try and extract commercial revenue on those platforms in order to reinvest in content and deliver more value? So we are exploring whether some of our titles, not news, not current affairs, there would never be any presenter host reads selling pizzas to you on this is about some ad placement on Spotify and Apple, and we are exploring that and listening and having that debate.
And how do you
this
stop?
This is a very small part of a commercial revenue plan from studios, which in truth has got some independent companies very excited by it who work with us because it might give them more chance to build revenue, others more concerned. There is an argument, and I'm not leading this work, this is from BBC Studios. There is an argument that we could help grow an advertising pie that is in truth 5 times smaller than America, even when you take into account population. How do we grow that pie? This may stimulate. And there is another argument that it might hurt that pie. So I guess we have opened that out. We are exploring it. Nothing is happening tomorrow. It may not happen at all. It's an exploration. Let's have the debate.
Because the danger always is that the advertising tail, wags the public service dog, that inevitably in making programmes which had advertising, you look at what the advertisers want, and then you produce the programmes they want, so which may not be what public service wants.
100% reassure you, this would be a proportionate, measured way of helping bring some revenue back in to put back into public service programme making.
All right, could I, when you hear all of this, and it's very exciting, it's challenging, it's scaring and everything else, but is it possible for a young person coming into this industry who isn't middle class, doesn't have parents in the business, doesn't live in London, to even think about having a career in the new world of audio?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible, and it's happening. And in many ways, I think the fact that we're in such an exciting time for audio, with so many changes, with new stations appearing, with a lot more opportunity in the podcast space and streaming and internet radio, more and more community stations popping up as well. I think possibly more than ever, there is an opportunity to be able to have a career in the audio industry.
But will
Now,
you get paid?
whether
I
or
mean,
not
I
it's...
listen to what you're saying, but I know a large number of podcasts made by people who aren't paid. I know a large number of young people are sleeping on friends' floors, or are actually have richer parents who can subsidise the first stages of their career. That's a reality, isn't it?
It absolutely is. So while there's the opportunity there, which is really exciting, I think there is a serious issue with investment from the industry and from those who fund the industry into that new talent.
I mean, one
and
of
not
the key
just the
things you
new
want are
talent, but the
training.
talent progressing.
Sorry, forgive me, I tried to interrupt you. You're very keen on training, aren't you? Now, who funds training, and how much training is there available to young people who are prepared to take the risk?
Yeah, well, the problem is there isn't that much training anymore. So the shape of our industry has changed. There are fewer jobs, permanent jobs available, and where they are, they're really hard to get them, and they tend to be centred in the city hubs, predominantly London. But even if you go outside of London, they're in Manchester or Salford, they're in Glasgow. They're not outside of those city hubs. So how do you find them? And there's fewer of them. When you're in a permanent employed position, your company has a responsibility to provide training, to provide mentorship, to provide development. In an industry where we're growing more and more invested in freelancers and independent production companies and very small businesses, who is providing that training and ongoing development? Well, we as an industry, we believe at the Radio Academy should all be coming together. That's why we work with the BBC, with Bauer, with production companies, and build partnerships to say, well, actually, it's in the best interest of our audio industry as a whole if we all invest in development for people coming into the industry.
Well, you're saying, sorry to interrupt you, you're saying, yeah, it would be sensible and we should do this, but it's not on the whole happening, is it? I mean, have we got, well, I don't think we have got substantial investment in training in audio. Do you? Tell me, do we? Right, so who is going to provide it and why aren't they providing it now? What about the BBC directly? What could the BBC do that it isn't doing at the moment for freelancers who are working in the industry as a whole and not directly employed by the BBC? What would you like them to do?
Well, John, I'd love you to write us a cheque so that we can start providing some training. No, seriously, it's about all of the companies proportionately saying, well, actually, you know, we have this much stake in the industry. We rely on these people who are our members at the Radio Academy to be able to provide that business to us. And to be fair, you know, BBC Sounds does support that. I think there needs to be more. There are other organisations as well that the Radio Academy works very closely with who are there and ready to be able to provide hands-on training, development opportunities. There's Audio Train run by Audio UK. It's massively underfunded. There is the Radio Academy's RAMP mentoring programme to be able to help people to get that next step. When you've been in the industry 5, 6, 7 years, where do you go from here? How do you get to that leadership position? So these programmes multi-track with bringing new people, new and diverse people into the industry, giving them paid internships and training to be able to then even have a chance for applying for those jobs and getting those commissions. These initiatives, they all exist, but they're all woefully underfunded, and there's also no follow-on afterwards. So you might sign up to an initiative, that's great. So our company has put together a paid internship. We've taken on 3 people. You've had a brilliant time for 3 months, and then you wave goodbye and off they go and you carry on in your business. And nothing has changed in the industry because we don't have those visible paths through the industry, and we're not joined up in terms of, okay, so we've got an independent creator who out of their own love, in their own bedroom, at night time after they've got home from their job, are making podcasts. They're connecting with communities that we've never been able to connect with before, and we're hearing voices where there's not space for them on the radio because you've only got a 24-hour schedule. So you've got these brilliant creators, but there is a real disconnect between all of these people who are coming to the industry with an opportunity and actually being able to earn a living and sort of get through to the gatekeepers, if you like.
But you see, I think, you know, you've got a BBC that's lost 30%, it keeps on telling us, at least, well, actually more, I think now, 30% of its income in 10 years. It's having very difficult cuts. It's cutting some members of its staff and making very difficult decisions. You've got a large number of podcasts that aren't making money at all. where's the money going to come to fund the sort of training you and I'm sure lots of people think is essential?
You can't afford not to put that money in.
No,
So
but
if you're going to make...
you're making the case for it, which I think just about everybody would agree with. But where's the funding going to come from?
If you were to take, so if you've got a programme budget, you know, the BBC, to take an example, is expanding the amount of content being put out into the world. There are different ways that that's happening. More and more it's through commissioning rather than in-house programmes. Each of those programmes have a budget. If we could look at those, that's a way. If we could look at how the BBC is shrinking, and not just the BBC, but many of the companies are making redundancies, they're reducing their headcount, well, the budgets that were there set for looking after your staff, you know, is that all just going with the cost of employment? Can some of that be put towards, well, okay, we're now relying on freelancers because we don't have the workforce. We're now relying on production companies. Can we channel some of that resource and some of that money to those independent charities and companies to be able to then redistribute that? There is, you know, it's not actually a lot of money. We're not talking, you know, one programme budget can fund an entire training programme.
I wonder how much you think that actually the BBC in-house training, this, I should say, is a hobby horse of mine when I was an independent producer. I thought, you've got a BBC legal department. You've got a lot of editors there with a lot of experience. If they ran between 6 and 8 in the evening, you know, once a week for anybody, freelancers who were in the business, and simply talked through the legal problems they faced, the editorial solutions to it, you could actually give young people a lot of training about the difficulties of the law and educational training at no great expense. So do you think, Jonathan, there is one of, if we are to continue supporting the BBC and continue to support the licence fee for the moment, that you should be doing more, if you like, in-house training for out-house people?
Yeah, I think the first thing is you've got to be judged on your current doing, right? We spent £500,000 a year on a project called Audio Lab, which allows grassroots people to make their first ever podcast series, right? We are in conversations with Multitrack at the moment about supporting a scheme from the independent sector because there's a lack of funding in it. So we are making decisions, even in the financial climate we're in, that will protect this. We have put £500,000 a year of extra commissioning into our nation, so the commissioning from Cardiff, Belfast and Glasgow will allow opportunities across the UK. It's a fair challenge that we need to do more, but like what I would say is we probably need to celebrate the current doing we are doing a bit more as well, because I think it's very easy we're not doing stuff. I've just listed a few big ticket items that we've done in the last 3 years. So I think we've just got to work out how we build on that.
And can I add to that as
Sorry,
well?
can I just bring Matt in? And then...
Yeah, I was just going to say, sector-specific training organisations that were government funded, a lot of that money has disappeared over the last 5 to 10 years. So Skill Set, which is sort of the screens and audio training body, has been significantly had its budget cut over the last few years. So you'd also hope that actually perhaps those things might be recharged as well that would support some of this too. I mean, David, you had the Audio Content Fund, which sort of did elements of that as well.
Yeah, I think the Audio Content Fund was a really interesting project, and this was, you know, a pot of money, and production companies could pitch to it to get the cash to make programmes, because actually it's the money that makes quality programmes. That's where it comes from, rather than the broadcaster. They get the money, fund it well, and you'll create some, you know, some decent content. But I'm interested in this whole area, and I think there's a role too for higher education. I see David in the audience here from the University of Kent. I'm chair of Notts TV, amongst other things. It's a local TV licensee based in the university, and we're giving people hands-on chance to do things for real, and they're going off to, you know, to jobs. Because at the other end, you know, we're trying to recruit people, and I think we'd all say that sometimes we struggle, you know, despite the fact it's a competitive world, we struggle to get the right candidate for the right job with the right blend of skills. So, you know, there are problems all the way up this ladder, I think.
All right, now I interrupted you, sorry.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to pick up on your point about what the BBC, for example, and I think this isn't just the BBC's responsibility, this is across the whole audio spectrum. I'm also looking at Spotify and Audible and Amazon Studios, all of those companies, goal hangers, you know, the big production companies, any company that is investing in and part of the audio industry needs to be putting the money into it. And with regards to that sort of idea around, you know, in-house training, so the Radio Academy works with Audio Lab. We are now able to provide that follow-on that I was talking about. You go through an Audio Lab process and training, and you create a podcast. You then move from that and come onto our RAMP mentoring program. It's a really beautiful way of how with not that much money, you can actually support the industry if you work together on it. We also, the Radio Academy is very grateful to all of our patrons and supporters who do give their time. We do have, you know, the commissioners, the heads of stations, the producers, giving talks, giving their time free to our members, and I think that's another way that we can support it. You know, you only need a couple of £1,000 a year to be able to suddenly have a whole host of these sorts of events. So I don't think it's about where do we find the money. It's about all coming together and making a commitment to be able to do this in a sustainable way.
I just want to raise one other issue before I bring questions outside, and it is about local radio. I'm sorry that, Jonathan, you're having to take all of the difficult questions in this way.
He's going to.
There is the big question, David. I want you about whether actually what the BBC is doing in its push to be digital first is actually losing or moving away from what it's very good at, which is a relationship with the audience built up in local communities for digital. And David, could you just outline your concerns about it?
Yeah, it sounds as if I'm having a go at the BBC. I absolutely believe in the BBC. I want a successful BBC, and sometimes think it doesn't actually help itself on occasions. But with local radio, clearly there's been a real change in the last 3 or 4 years. First of all, a different focus on who is supposed to be listening. And secondly, of course, many of the stations not having programmes with, it's not about whether the programmes are broadcast from the area, it's about whether they're locally relevant to that area. That has all changed, and there's been a serious audience decline, and although the BBC is charged with attracting more C2DE audiences, it's lost 1 million in the last 2 years alone from BBC Local Radio, owing to these various changes. And I think it comes back to what you're saying, Roger. It's about what is radio about, and I think we in this room know what radio is about. It's not about the device or whatever, it's about the relationship it has with a human being sitting in their kitchen, in their lounge, and the way they relate to this wonderful thing called radio. And that relationship has been interrupted because the program's all been changed, the presenters have been changed, and it no longer relates to them in their patch. And it's an expensive business. It's a really expensive business doing local radio. Commercial radio, we can't do it. It's a huge proportion of commercial radio companies were actually losing money. That can't continue. It's got to be a job for a publicly funded broadcaster to do well.
So your argument is essentially it's an area of market failure where classically public service should move in. Jonathan, the BBC's case, and I've never quite understood how the figures add up, has been that it is not disinvesting at all from local programming or local radio as we would have called it. It's spending the same amount, but it's redistributing that to digital. Is it now time to say, we've had an experiment, there are questionable results, let's look at it again, or is the BBC dead set on continuing its existing strategy as regards to local radio?
I think you outlined in your the Enders analysis at the start around audience trends why there may be, and I've heard Matt as an independent industry strategist say, I can understand that strategy of keeping the same amount of money but reinvesting a small part of it to attract people via online means, via news, and via, for example, podcasts. So without getting into conversations of things I don't run and around execution, do I understand that strategy and agree with that strategy of partitioning some of the money to have a wider role than just linear radio when it comes to delivering local? I understand that strategy, yes. And what I would say, I understand everything David said about how hard it is for commercial radio. Barely a squeak of noise about Cornwall losing its only commercial station pirate a month ago. Wave lost from Lancashire. The amount of noise over, I do understand the passion in local stations about this, but in relative terms, this is a small amount of money to try and drive digital performance alongside linear radio. And I think the strategy is right. I'm not in charge of executing it, you know that. But do I understand the strategy? Do I listen to an expert like Matt who can understand the strategy? Yes.
But there's the one other factor, briefly, which is we have we have maybe a stubborn, but a significant, in the millions of people who don't go and can't go or won't go online. And if you move too quickly, you're going to effectively, both in television and radio, switch them off.
Yeah, if you move too slowly, we lose the case for the licence fee. If we move too slowly and do not deliver to all audiences, that's an even greater risk, Roger.
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt you. Anyone has some questions? If you put your hands up, and I'll try and get you. Gentlemen there, if you'd say who you are, the microphone's just coming to you. Anybody else like to speak, put your hand up and I'll come to you.
Hello, it's Anthony Wills. I'm one of the VLV trustees. A question for Jonathan, really, specific to Radio 2, for which I worked eons ago. There's an increasing trend for Radio 2 to put out brand new programs, and what I would call built programs, and I think you understand what I mean by that. In other words, they're pre-recorded, they've got interviews and inserts and so on. They're not just the daily, what a previous controller used to call pop and prattle. Well, actually, he was managing director of radio, so that was his description of. He also said, engage brain before opening mouth. And I'm not certain how much of that goes on at the moment. But the point I'm making is the point I'm making is that it does seem to work in favour of sounds, because they are now advertising programmes and saying you can hear it on BBC Sounds. But in fact, it is still put out on the analogue station, but at midnight or even 3 a.m. I mean, there was a series on ABBA recently.
Forgive me, I don't quite see the point that you're making, sir.
Well, what I'm saying is that, does he agree that sound is being given too much preference over analogue?
John.
Yeah, no, I don't agree. I think that, look, the crown jewels of Radio 1 and Radio 2 as live programmes, that they are the biggest shows on sounds as well as on radio, right? They are absolute crown jewel priorities for us. But in a world where there's slightly less money to play with, if certain programmes can do a job on a schedule and on demand, they're delivering good value for us. So as almost like a second tier alongside those crown jewel live shows at breakfast and drive time, I can't speak for every schedule decision, Matt, and you know that, but can I see where we get to that point of certain shows doing that on a schedule and on demand? I can, because every year there is a growing number of people who are no longer listening to our live radio output. And we have to think about that. We have to protect our position in 2030, for argument's sake. So I agree it's about getting the balance right. I agree it's about scheduling it carefully, and maybe we've got to look at that in the round. But the major live shows, and what the job they do on live is still absolutely critical. Even in my job, I'm looking at the live performance of that as much as I am on demand.
Another question, lady here. Okay, I'll come to you next, sir.
Let's be one for you.
Sorry, gentlemen.
Yeah, no, don't worry. I was wondering, what is it considered to be, and this might be a silly or arcane-sounding question, but...
Sorry, could you say who you are, sir?
Yeah, my name is Hal Conti. I'm a PhD student at the University of Warwick. I'm studying public service broadcasting. What is it considered when the BBC opens a new service? So they're now having to go through these value consultations for these new radio show spin-offs. But, okay, so the BBC introduced a new TikTok channel for news I think it was in 2022, right after the beginning of the Ukraine war. And there are competitors in that area. You could think of things like Politics Joe. So, what is the precise determination of what triggers the launch of essentially a public value test for a new service? Why some areas and not others?
Is there someone from ITC here who would Ofcom. Ofcom. Shows how old I am. Anybody from Ofcom here, just fill that in for us before Jonathan has to answer again? No?
There are, but it's not our team. But we can get back to details.
Would you like to elaborate? Hold on, here's the mic. And say who you are, please. Yeah, that's right.
Hi, yes, we are from Ofcom. We're listening in. We are not from that team, so I cannot tell you the exact the exact process, but I'll find you and get back to you on how that goes.
I was just going to say, I think there's sort of an interesting challenge for the BBC and all broadcasters about what should be where. And historically, it was very easy. You just had a radio channel or a TV channel, and it was very easy to say, well, this many people listen to a competitor, and I can compare this to that, and it should happen or it shouldn't happen. And what's a new service is really what drives sometimes the grumpiness from the commercial side. Because also a lot of these platforms haven't necessarily developed into businesses yet. They might be in the future. So I might invest in a news TikTok channel because I think that's going to be successful. But it's hard to say that someone would crush my business that doesn't really make any money at the moment. But I hope in the future it will be something. And this is with any publicly funded organisation, that becomes more of the challenge now of trying to help them develop for their audiences, but also how you can also leave some open space for there to be some commercial competition.
Right, gentleman here at the front, you had a question, yeah. Sorry, could you have the mic? Right here at the front. Yeah, it's coming, sir. Sorry, here, beg your pardon. Sorry. Yeah, this gentleman with his hand up. Thank you.
Hello, Andre Leon, producer, presenter. Grew up on pop music in South Africa, listening to a radio station called LM Radio, which played music that the pirates used to play in Britain when the SABC banned the Beatles because they said they were more popular than Christ. But Lorenz and Mark's radio, for happy listening, was broadcasting on shortwave to South Africa playing the pop music. And I joined that radio station when I was 17 years old, leaving my little home studio to be a controller. That meant that I played in all the music for the top jocks. That was great fun. But coming over to England, I was amazed that the time when I arrived, that when Radio 1 split from the light program to become Radio 1, and 2 became 2, that Radio 1 didn't commercialize itself, because the SABC had commercial music channels and non-commercial stations, like their English service and Afrikaans service, were actually...
Sorry to...
yes.
It's a fascinating story, but are you essentially saying that Radio 2 should be commercialised now?
No, I think Radio 1 should be commercialised. I think 2 is fine as it is, but it's lost its light touch.
Why would you select Radio 1 to be commercialised?
Because Radio 1 is very much more poppy and aimed at the 16 to 24. There is something called narrowcasting in broadcasting here. And I find that there's a lot of duplication going on at the moment with musical content. And this is becoming problematical on all the platforms. And what I want to say to David Lloyd is that I think they've expanded and continue to expand their variety in music, but there are still some gaps in the market to be filled. And there's certain music genres that are being lost to music listeners and lovers of music all over, no matter what your age.
Well, sorry, sir. Thank you. If I could, Jonathan, you've obviously, when you approach the issue of, say, Radio 1 and justifying it, you know, there's an internal justification, which is that if you don't get a young audience listening to the BBC, you may lose them forever. But you make the additional case that Radio 1 would not be provided by anybody else because it does extra things. What extra things does it actually do that a commercial broadcaster doesn't do?
Okay, well, one headline would be, it is where many under 16-year-olds get their news in this country, is listening to the bulletins on Radio 1, right? And there is a new music show at 6 o'clock every weeknight. There's a wide variety of distinctiveness on Radio 1. But the short answer to the question is, Radio 1 is a very important part of delivering universality to the BBC. And by the way, all of the commercial radio would not want Radio 1 to be commercialised and have adverts on it, because that would have a massive impact on the likes of Global and Bauer, who are running businesses. One of the great things about this country is a licence fee paying for BBC, advertising on a growing commercial radio, and podcasts can have all sorts of funding models on it. We should protect that like mad. That would be my...
Well, those of us with long memory remember Alan Peacock, set up by Mrs. Thatcher to basically deliver the argument for advertising on the BBC and finding the whole of the advertising industry say, please don't do this, you will destroy the rest of the industry. And that would still, David, be roughly the same argument today.
Yeah.
So please don't go with advertising the BBC,
And
it's too widespread.
There's some new data from Radio Centre where they did an economic analysis of the BBC radio stations and what it would take for them to take advertising and the effect that would have on commercial radio. And it would probably, they predict it would reduce commercial radio's revenue by a third, which would probably make every commercial radio group unprofitable. And the BBC stations would have to halve their investment in their output. So what you were left with on Radio 1, Radio 2, and Radio 4 would be significantly different than what's today. So it's sort of everybody loses if we go down that road.
Right, so
Might I just add something, one more thing?
Sorry, sir, I beg your pardon. There's a gentleman behind you. I do apologise. A gentleman
afterwards.
behind you. Can I have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, it's Gareth from the International Broadcasting Trust. Jonathan, another one for you, I'm afraid. Sorry about this. 2019, James Purnell, when he was still at the BBC, said the BBC Sounds would introduce a public service algorithm. Just last month, Tim Davies said that the BBC would be launching an ethical algorithm. Can you tell us when this will actually happen? When will BBC Sounds have an ethical algorithm? And what does it mean?
It already has one. It already has one. There are 5 million different versions of BBC Sounds for every single one of you that experiences it. It's a blend of algorithm and human curation. So, for example, there is a music rail which has human beings putting 30 titles in it, and an algorithm helps put the 6 things that we think are most relevant to you in the rail, right? So already there is a blend of that. Now, we don't believe in ultra-person, like it would be wrong for the BBC to go on a hyper-personalised route. That's my view, and we're very strong. I've built a team of human curators who think about our charter commitments around education, around impartial news, around delivering content from all over the country. What algorithms do is help make hundreds of titles narrowed down for you into a bit more of a bucket of what is, because if your experience on Sounds is not for me, you're not going to be with us anyway. So we already have been doing exactly what you describe, but human beings curating and human beings influencing algorithm put together, we think delivers the right kind of personalisation.
Time for one more question. Gentleman there, third row from the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Beveridge, VLV. It's for Jonathan, I'm afraid. What do you say to the argument that says that if you accept advertising on podcasts, it's obviously a slippery slope? It's about income generation, and then they're going to say we're going to accept adverts on television and elsewhere.
So all I can say is, from the person who is inside the BBC, is that that is not the conversation we're having around this tactic. We would see that as a completely giant leap that is not in question. This is a conversation about platforms outside the BBC. So on the thing that we talked about earlier, which, as I said, it's a proposal that we may or may not do, we did audience testing of what would you think if we had ads in that space, and unanimously, like, because we would be worried about the audience reaction to that. Unanimously, the audiences are like, we already thought you probably would have ads in a space that is an ad environment that we expect. So there is absolutely, like, I have been here, and with everyone nodding their heads on, what is successful about our industry? A license fee funded BBC, commercial radio with ads, and that is what we believe in. That is what we believe in. This is not a step to something else. Our job is to explore all different types of commercial revenue, because we are putting less money into BBC Audio than we ever have before in real terms. So our job is to find the commercial opportunities to invest. Otherwise, we will struggle to find new talent and bring that through, more commissioning. Our job is to protect the business and explore that. But I totally agree, it's a different territory, but I would say nowhere near the giant step that you're describing there.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, and I just want to ask the panel an impossible question, which is where they think we will be with audio in 5 years' time. I'll make one supposition. The next government will not significantly increase the licence fee, given all the other constraints upon it. I mean, defence, health, whatever. So let me start with you, David. Where do you think we will be? I mean, will Boom Radio survive?
I hope so. Otherwise, I'll blame you.
There's a danger of coming out of these sessions thinking that the whole world is collapsing around us. Actually, as Matt said, it's a really exciting time for audio. We've created the biggest audio supermarket there's ever been. And yes, people are listening in different ways, and kids age 17 have got more interesting things to do in their bedrooms than I had when I was 17. Life has moved on, things are changing. But I think what we've got, because Marconi didn't bother in 1896 when he came over here to invent catch-up and smart speakers and online listening, we've had to cobble this whole system together. And what we've got, for example, an hour of local content about Oxford can be distributed in, I think, 7 different ways, regulated, paid for, distributed in 7 different ways. It's all a bit of a mess, and I hope in 5 years' time things are just a bit clearer so we can all get on and create great radio, whatever it's called.
Aradhna, how about you, 5 years' time?
Yeah.
Well, dream about what trading programs will be in place.
I mean, other than just saying what David just said, I agree that it's a really exciting time. I think we're going to see more audio content. The dream is to have a lot more variety and diversity of voice in the content that we're able to get in 5 years' time. And I hope that we continue to have this diverse way of how you listen to it, be it on the radio, be it through catch-up, any device. I think that's a brilliant thing, and I think we're getting there.
And Matt, I mean, given what's going to happen in the podcast world, lots of people are making losses. Surely we're going to see, aren't we going to see fewer podcasts? Or what do you think is going to happen?
No, just like books, there's going to be almost an infinite supply of podcasts. I think the thing we haven't had yet in the UK is loads of international hits. We see it in television and film and music. We're brilliant exporters of creative content here. We haven't had many shows that have really crossed over. And when they cross over to the US and to other markets and emerging markets like India for this material, then that could be a transformative effect on your business and can make lots of money. So I think there's a big opportunity international. In radio, my big worry is around young audiences. We touched on it before. Whereas if you're a commercial broadcaster, it is easier to look after older audiences who quite like listening to the radio and to put more of your effort into that and forget or assume that it's someone else's job to grow the new listeners for the future to replace them. And so, you know, if somebody runs a radio station for children, we think a lot about our audiences, and then there's a big teenage gap, and then can be a big young adult gap as well. And so can the media companies, BBC and commercial radio, develop new products and new content and new ways of doing audio to appeal to audiences, and particularly for the public broadcaster, making sure that gives great information about citizenship and democracy and all of those things, where a lot of that audience gets their media from things that come from overseas that maybe doesn't do things that we like and reflect being British.
And Jonathan, let's assume that the licence fee is in place in 5 years' time. Let's assume that, however, it's in real terms the present value. Where will the BBC be in audio?
I think I would hope contributing to an even more buoyant industry, which feels so much more energetic now. I remember radio conferences 15 years ago where we were like wondering what was going to happen next, right? And so that's why, you know, what I would say is, in this industry of ours, like I know we've talked about the challenges of BBC and commercial, like we have been shoulder to shoulder in things like radio reviews with the government, where the biggest fear is that the likes of Spotify, and you talked about talent schemes earlier, you go and check how many talent schemes Spotify announce and then don't deliver on, right? Spotify, Amazon, Echo in your home as a gatekeeper. We need to stick together so those American gatekeepers don't own this industry that we're the best in the world at. So I would say, as long as we remember that kind of collegiate nature of sticking together, we can still be buoyant and energetic. Matt's right, probably more focused still on the under-25s and how we give audio habit is right. Probably still need to think about that. But I believe there's an energy and buoyancy that will see us in good shape in 7 years' time.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all. And perhaps you'd like to show your appreciation of that.